if you're not a writer, you've probably heard and felt that genius characters are incredibly hard to write. This is because writers have to be geniuses themselves in order to write genius characters, and they're not, usually. But when it comes to writing geniuses, writers do have one advantage. They know things before the characters do. This can be details about other characters, plot points, etc. This allows writers to create uncannily perceptive characters that can then act on their accurate perceptions, that are, of course, only accurate in the first place because the writer already knows the answer. But writers need to be careful when doing this. If a character goes overboard with this, it can threaten the audience's suspension of disbelief. If this happens too often or too noticeably, people will start to catch on to the fact that the character isn't actually a genius. They just know whatever the writer wants them to know, which could be everything. This is, of course, boring and uninteresting, which is why characters like these often fall flat or are accompanied by some other great flaw like cripplingly terrible social skills. But what if you don't want your genius to be socially stupid? Well, then you need to strike a balance between impressive genius and subtlety. This brings me to Hobie Brown from Across the Spiderverse. The Spiderverse writers aren't necessarily geniuses themselves, so how did they manage to strike the perfect tantalizing balance between genius character and subtlety with Hobie Brown? Welcome to Writing Westward. My name is Wes. Today we're talking about how the Spiderverse writers used a trick to write a genius character like Hobie Brown, so there will be spoilers for Across the Spiderverse, and you have been warned. So let's start with explaining why Hobie is a genius. To put it simply, he picks up on things that others in the film don't, and then takes small strategic actions that are informed by his own perceptiveness to subtly yet impactfully influence the events of the story later on. And he does this in such a way that his influence is largely undetected by the characters he's conspiring against. As is common with the Spider-Verse movies, Hobie Brown gets his own narrated intro sequence, where he comes off as an embellished punk anarchist, saying things that make it hard to take the character seriously and make it seem like the character will be mostly used for comic relief. Like saying he hates labels and then proceeding to drop a dozen labels in the next sentence. It's through this lens that Hobie disguises his own agency from not only the characters he's working against, but also from the audience. One of the first examples of this we see is when Miles is quote-unquote invited back to Spider Society HQ after disrupting a canon event. Hobie continues his embellished rebel punk facade by saying that he doesn't follow orders and neither does Miles. We later can understand that this was an effort by Hobie trying to protect Miles from what he knew was awaiting Miles back at Spider Society HQ. Similarly, Hobie is also the one who teaches Miles how to break through the barriers with his palms, which is how he originally escapes from the electric cage Miguel O'Hara traps him in the first place. Without Hobie's subtle yet impactful influence here, Miles wouldn't have been able to escape and the plot wouldn't have progressed in the way it does. Finally, the most prevalent example of this is when Hobie is taking seemingly random junk off the wall under the guise of being a punk rock nuisance and sticking it to the man by vandalizing Spider Society HQ. Miles even lightly chastises him for this seemingly asinine action. On rewatch, the audience realizes that it's with these very same parts he lifted from the walls that we see him craft a new multiversal travel watch for Gwen. With this watch, Gwen assembles a team to rescue Miles. Without Hobie, Miles and Gwen would both be cooked. Without Hobie, there wouldn't even be a next Spider-Verse movie. Though I guess there still might not be one because of various production issues. But regardless, it's hard to emphasize just how much influence and agency Hobie Brown had over the plot of this movie while actively disguising it from both the antagonist and the audience. He's a genius, and his influence over the plot shows that. This is where the subtlety I mentioned comes in. Hobie understands that he needs to hide his motives and actions from the antagonist of the film, but this subterfuge also doubles as a device to mask Hobie's intelligence from the audience. which is of paramount importance when creating a genius character in this fashion. On rewatch, it's apparent that Hobie is a genius with much more agency over the plot than he'd initially have you believe. But on first watch, the audience doesn't realize he's a genius until the final act of the film, when all the dominoes Hobie has set up begin to fall. And this is the secret that ultimately allowed the Spider-Verse writers to write a genius without being geniuses themselves. They allow Hobie to realize and accurately perceive things that only the writers would reasonably know. But that doesn't affect the audience's suspension of disbelief, because they cleverly mask it until the critical point where Hobie's influence is finally understood by the audience. And this mass genius to reveal setup does a lot of heavy lifting for the audience. The revealing is thrilling to watch on its own, and more importantly, the audience never gets a chance to roll their eyes at how Hobie constantly realizes things that only the writers could feasibly actually know, because they don't see it, they don't notice it until later. Though this archetype of character does usually work better in a supporting role, it's sometimes hard, though doable, to pull this off of a main protagonist who's masking their true intentions from both the other characters in the story and the audience for long periods of time, unless that omission of information is an intentional way to create tension, but that's a topic for a different video. This video is about Hobie Brown and how the Across the Spider-Verse writers cleverly wrote him as a genius by allowing him to be especially perceptive and influential while simultaneously downplaying his agency until the critical point of reveal. A technique that allowed the Spider-Verse writers to write a genius character while avoiding many of the usual pitfalls that comes with writing genius characters. Anyway, I'm a YouTuber. You know what I want, so do the like, comment, subscribe stuff if you feel like it, and I'll see you next time. Bye.